All right, our next quick take will be with Miss Kerri-Ann Hayes. Kerri-Ann Hayes is a consultant with Ministry Architects. Yes, still? Okay. And the author of The Accessible Church. She has served in children's and family ministry for over 20 years. She has spent the last 13 years focused on making the church accessible to families with disabilities or traumatic backgrounds. Kerri-Ann and her husband Tom live in Claremont, Florida, where they raise their 3 children, Brenna, Mackenzie, and Cameron. All right, please join me in welcoming Miss Kerri-Ann.
So I would like to take you back to a Wednesday night when 200 middle and high schoolers converged on my church. It was youth group. And quickly, our lobby was filled with sounds. You could hear talking and laughing and loud music, and games were being played, and there was the scent of pizza. And did I mention 200 teenagers? Well, I was working the check-in area. That's how we were keeping track of all these teenagers as they came in. And I saw this young man who was standing just outside the snack bar line. And I didn't recognize him, and I knew most of the kids. And he looked a little bit uncomfortable. He was alone, clearly, and he wasn't making eye contact with anyone else, and he wasn't talking to anyone else. And I felt in that moment like he needed some help. So I asked the volunteer on the other side of the check-in counter, like, hey, just go and ask him, how can we help you? And sure enough, his name was David, and he needed help navigating the snack bar line and talking to the teenagers who were serving the pizza on the other side. We would later find out that David, it was his first time there, and that David had autism. And David was going to need more than just help navigating our lobby. He was going to need help to navigate our youth ministry. I have spent the last over 2 decades working in children and family ministry, and several of those years have been spent in special needs. And when I was focused on the Accessible Church, it was devoted to children who had special needs and traumatic backgrounds so that their families could be a part of our church. I very creatively titled the last chapter, What's Next? But if I'm honest with you all, friends, and you won't tell anyone else, I had no idea what was next. I didn't know what was next for our church, and I didn't know what was next when it came to the disability community. Because for me, it seems to be always changing. The terms are always changing. In Luke 14, Jesus refers to people with disabilities as the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Today, we refer to them as people with disabilities or special needs or neurodiverse. See, it's always changing. Statistics change, and how we serve people change. Something that doesn't change is youth pastors and their desire to serve the teenagers that they're in charge of. And as I have the opportunity to work with youth pastors around the country, I hear over and over again that what they want to do is create a community where students feel like they can belong. But the question is, does that apply to our teenagers who have disabilities or are neurodiverse? See, we can have teenagers come into our church or adults come into our church, and they might have a visible disability, and that causes us to immediately begin to think through, how are we going to accommodate them? The teenager that comes in a wheelchair, do we need to open the door for them, or how do we create a space for them at the table of the youth ministry? It's a little bit more difficult when teenagers are coming in and they have invisible challenges, things like ADHD, autism, anxiety, or sensory processing disorder. You see, these invisible challenges, if they're not shared with us, we may not become aware of them until they play out in a behavior that we question. So for youth leaders in our world, some of them are asking the question of, well, are these teenagers even in our church? And my answer would be, if you have more than 10 in your church, more than 10 teenagers or children, chances are good they're in your church. And if they're not, the bigger question is, why not? Why are they not in your church? So I like to refer to this as ministry math. So let's take a look at some numbers. If 1 in 6 kids, and that's ages 3 to 17, has a diagnosed disability, if 6.1 million children and students have ADHD, or 1 in 36 has autism, what are the odds that these kids and teens are coming into our church? I think it's good. The question is, what are we going to do when they come in? Are we going to be accessible to them? Are we going to welcome them? So where do we start? I think that we start with expecting that they are coming. You see, when we expect that they are coming, we will move from a reactive response to an intentional plan that says, we were expecting you, and we're glad you're here. And that plan will start off with us being curious. We need to gather some information about our students. That can be as simple as a registration card that asks at the bottom, does the student have medical needs, allergies, or will they need help to participate in the student ministry? If they do say that they're going to need additional help, maybe we follow it up and dig a little bit deeper, offering just a brief intake form. Will the student thrive in our worship environment? Will they be comfortable in our very relational small groups? Here's what's really important. If no one ever tells you that they have a diagnosis, it doesn't matter. We can still help them. We can still be curious, and we can still ask those 4 little words that we asked to David in the lobby. How can we help? So the next step would be that we want to identify the barriers. We want to identify the barriers in our youth ministry, and they come in 2 forms: physical barriers and social barriers. And I'd like to start with the physical because I think those are easier for us to identify and for us to remove. The first thing that I would suggest that you do is walk in the doors of your church and try to see it with fresh eyes. Are the bathrooms easy to find? Is there clear signage? Because if I visit your youth ministry and I have to have a tour guide to find the restroom, I don't feel like I'm welcome there. I don't feel like I'm an insider for sure. But for the student who has autism or anxiety, they might not want to approach you. They want to feel independent when they walk into your youth ministry. But how about the youth event itself? What if we posted a schedule in the lobby, or maybe it's on the screen in the worship center, that lets our students know that we're going to start at this time with fellowship. We're going to move into worship, then we're going to go into a message, we're going to have small group time, and then you get to go home. We set really clear expectations for our students and allow them to be prepared for the transitions that are going to take place. Sound is a big barrier in our churches for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. My husband and I attended a church recently, locally, and my husband loves worship, and the louder the better. The first song was great, and I was really enjoying it. By the second one, my husband and I each got an alert on our watches. We were in a dangerous environment because of the sound level during worship. It was over 90 decibels. So I know that this is going to be super unpopular with any youth leaders that ever watch this, but one way to remove that barrier is we could tone it down. But even if we do tone it down, we still want to remove the barrier by supplying earplugs. And we want to supply them in a way that the teenagers know where to find them, that they don't have to necessarily go and ask somebody, but that they can be independent and go get those earplugs. Another answer would be we might want to rethink ministry and decide that we can let the student with autism that's uncomfortable in the worship environment step outside the worship environment just for the worship time. So another aspect of youth ministry is that it is active, it is exciting, we have games, they're competitive and sometimes messy, and they're not for everyone. So creating a space somewhere in the youth ministry that allows people to escape all of the fun that we have prepared for them. I visited a church recently that was devoted to, specifically really wanted to be welcoming to neurodiverse teens. So they decided to create what they called a chill space. You and I might know it as a sensory room, but it was super cool and it was great even for adults. It was low budget. It was a dimly lit room with no fluorescent lights allowed. Christmas lights were hanging from the ceiling. There was a low table on the floor, and on that table were adult coloring books, colored pencils, a puzzle for a collaborative activity, not a competitive one. And on the shelf were some fidgets and even handheld individual puzzles for the students. This room quickly became the most popular spot to be in the youth ministry, and not just for the neurodiverse. All of the teens seem to need to escape the world for a little while and go to this nice, quiet space. In your church, if you choose to have a chill out space like this, or you want to let your teens leave the room during worship, always be sure that we're still following our church safe church policies. So on to the next. That would be our social barriers. Social barriers are going to be harder because now we're dealing with people. And we need people to understand a few things. We can start off by creating awareness. Just sharing with the volunteers who are serving the youth, the statistics that I shared earlier will help them to understand that the likelihood of these teens, if we're fortunate, will be walking in the doors of our church. Next, we can train our volunteers. They don't need to be experts in autism or sensory processing disorder or ADHD, but just equipping our volunteers to understand that the boy that they're serving who has autism may not make eye contact and he may struggle relationally in his small group. Or the girl who is struggling with her impulsivity or who is excessively talking, it's because of her ADHD, that she's not necessarily being disrespectful. Or the boy who always exits the sanctuary during the worship time is not leaving because he doesn't want to be a part of worship, but he can't physically be present in that room. What we want to do is encourage our volunteers to understand that behavior is communication, and we want to encourage our volunteers to be curious before they're judgmental. In fact, they don't need to be judgmental at all. Just curious and ask those questions. How can we help? Then there's the resources, which are my favorite because they're the people. People are our greatest resources. So if we train our volunteers, we create the awareness, they can be partners to help us support teenagers coming into our youth ministry. Caregivers and parents are the experts on their teens. Calling up a caregiver and saying, hey, we want to help your child, your son, your daughter. How can we help them be successful in our youth ministry? What do we need to know? What do you want your student to get out of our biblical community? And then the number one expert is the student themselves. They know what they need. We need to be the ones who are willing to approach them and say, how can we help? So for the girl who's sitting just outside of the small group, how can we help? For the boy who leaves every week during worship, how can we help? For the girl who is excessively talking in small group and it's not out of disrespect, how can we help? For the parents who are working to lower their student to the feet of Jesus, how can we help? 4 little words. Thank you.